I'm Mark Turpin with 9line, and in part 2 of our series, we're going to configure Emergency Responder, pick up where we left off from Communications Manager, and drop in a basic configuration to represent what it would be like to integrate with 9line and automate those ERL updates and enable the off-premises user feature. So let's go ahead and dig in. So we're first going to just drop in some basic system configuration. By the way, there's nothing really fancy here going on. This is all out of the box stuff. We only have a single emergency responder in this particular deployment. So what you're going to find is essentially the CR server group is really just the one server. I'm setting some server group attributes, and essentially what this is going to define is who we should notify in the event of a problem. And if there's, say, a problem with tracking the phones, or we can't communicate and do some discovery on our switches, or whatever the case may be, we want to let somebody know about that problem. And so we define a mail server, and the source mail ID, that's the from address, and the to address is the system administrator mail ID. And essentially we're saying, hey, if you have a problem, CER, send a notification to this group. This is not for emergency call notifications. This is for system notifications. You can also turn on syslogging, which is pretty helpful. So this is an internal SMTP relay that we have that's also doing syslog recipient. So long story short, set this as appropriate for your organization, and then let's move on out of the server group settings. Update these here. Okay. Now let's go on, and we're going to go into our telephony settings. We get the config dropped in, and then we're going to talk about it real quick. Okay, so what we have here is, again, baked-in configuration comes out of the box with this. By default, CER is looking for 911 to be the primary route point. It would look for 912 to be a standby route point if we had an HA server, which we don't in this demo, but if we did, the secondary would be monitoring 912. And then we have a third route pattern, the 913 route pattern. Now, in our particular case, in our demo, we only use 911 and the 913, but essentially this is telling CER what to listen for and what to monitor on Communications Manager. If your environment, let's say you're just trying to test some things out and you want to play with some different numbers, this is where you would control that. So down below we have the Intrado route pattern. I'm just going to note real quick, where you see Intrado, you can easily replace that with the word 9line, and it means the same thing. So we have our route pattern settings. Remember, over in Communications Manager, we created a route pattern for 10.911, had a pre-dot drop on there, or discard digits rather. Essentially, this is the pattern that CER is going to call when it's trying to route a call for an Intrado ERL, or in our case, a 9line ERL. And this, you could have multiple if you had specific reasons, but ultimately you probably wouldn't. Most people set up the redundancy on the route pattern with route lists and so on. So I imagine you'll very likely just have one in a standard deployment. But you can have others if you have a specific reason to do it that way. And once this is defined at the system, you're good to go. You'll be able to use this for your future ERL ELIN configuration. So, all right, so let's move on after our telephony settings are all saved and updated here. All right, now we're going to go configure our Communications Manager. And once we get this configured, I will tell you what they mean, what these settings mean. We're just dropping in our basic configuration here. Again, just following along with the admin guide. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary here. We are going to define the Axel username. That's the user we created earlier. All right, so let's pause here real quick and let's talk about what's on this screen. So, the Communications Manager, this is referencing which Communications Manager is running that call manager service that we want to talk to. And the CTI Manager is essentially this. Really, I would say this is CTI Manager 1, and backup CTI Manager should be labeled 2, and backup CTI Manager 2 should be labeled 3. And the reason for that is this is relating to the CM groups and the servers that you have in that CM group that the CTI ports and route points are going to register to. So we want to make sure our CM group and the servers inside it match what we're defining over in CER for the CTI managers, and preferably in the same order, right? So you can have 3 CTI managers in your CM group, and you can configure them here as well. One of the things that didn't make the video, I'll just point out, is the telephony port address. So that should have been 6001 because I created my first CTI port as 6001. Because I created 2 ports, I would label the number of telephony ports as 2, so it automatically knows 6001, 6002 are the ports that it's going to be going for. So down below is the actual username. Now you'll notice this is not a required configuration item. What this is for is not only for the discovery part, but also the CER Axle user. Remember, that's the guy that we're using with our off-premises user piece. So all coming together now on the CER side. We'll go ahead and insert our Communications Manager config there. We're going to skip over the discovery for now. Let's define our first on-site alert recipient. This is going to be Mr. Example here. And they're going to be an example person with a phone number that CER can call and play a message saying that there's an emergency call. You can also send an email. And we're going to talk about email in a minute as well and how we customize that. Let's go ahead and create this user. Now you could make them an audit administrator where they can go in and look at the audit history and whatnot, or you can just make them a regular CER user. They're just going to make them a regular CER user this time. I'm going to create the I'm going to upload the certificate for the 9-line service. You're going to get that from your 9-line Customer Success Manager. You'll get the password and the URL to use. Don't use anything you see on the screen. This is not real. Just go ahead and save that. And now we'll create our default ALI values. This allows us to do a couple things. I'm going to pause it right here and talk about what these are doing, because it's doing more than what the eye can see. So right here, the company ID and customer name, we need all 4 of these fields to be pushed over to 9-line as part of the communication spec with emergency responder. And off-premises user portal does not show this information because we wouldn't want end users to put in the wrong thing here. So we set these defaults so that whenever an end user using OFP creates a record for their home or wherever they're working from, it includes these additional fields that aren't visible to the end user. It also is going to default it for you when you're configuring your Intrado ERLs inside the system, so that you will save yourself a couple steps on having to pick some options. But it's really important for the off-premises users. If you overlook this step, your off-premises users won't be able to submit address records. So this is a really important step here. All right, moving right along. Now we're going to go ahead and start to create our schedule for updates. You'll notice by default, the update schedules are disabled. I'm going to go ahead and add one here that is basically going to update twice a day, once at midnight, once at noon. And oops, got to pick the ALI update schedule there. Click add. Okay. And then I'm going to edit the other ones and enable them, because by default it's not scheduled to update. So we want to make sure that's turned on. Secondary status. Long short version of this is secondary status is if we have a address problem and we need to try it again. So that's the schedule for trying it again. All right, customizing the email message. I'm going to pause here for just a second. So the big thing about this email message is it's fine as is if the server name and, or excuse me, if the FQDN and the search domain of your computer in the office is matching where you deployed CER, but a lot of times that's not the case. Our voice domain is not always necessarily the same as our search suffix on our computer. So I like to go in here and set the FQDN so that our security team doesn't have to go in and type things in manually, and they can just click the link and go straight to the CER URL. So that's one update I like to point out. We'll keep going here and update that. Good to go. You can customize the email messages that go out to people if you want. You don't have to. I like the default. I just like to update that FQDN. All right, we're going to configure our default ERL. While I'm configuring this, I'm just going to point out something. You cannot configure the dynamic ERLs you're going to push to us until you've configured this default ERL. This is just being used for our unmapped phones, and really should never be used, right? We should always be locating those phones and pushing over the right address along with them, right? ELIN along with them. But in the event that you don't, this alley information that I have here represents what would go on the screen of the emergency responder alert recipient. So they're going to get that 123 Market Street and or 1234 Market Street. They're going to see St. Louis, Missouri, etc. They're also going to know that 201-555-000 number. We want to make sure they know that that's an unlocated phone, unmapped phone. So that's a bad thing, and we want to make sure we get in front of that and figure out why that happened so it doesn't happen again. All right, so now that we have our default configured, and by the way, over at 9line, we also want to know what your default ERL is, so when we do our testing with you, we make sure that we're not seeing that one, because that's going to come through with an empty address, because this is not an ERL, an ELIN that gets pushed to us. This stays inside CER, so if we get a call from this one, there's not going to be an address associated with it, and we're going to send it to the relay center so that they can figure out where that person is. So this is a very special one that we have to have in the system, but we want to make sure it's never being used, because this is not ideal. This is not good. All right, so now moving on, we'll go ahead and click Update and save the unmapped and unlocated default ERL, and now we'll move on. All right, let's go ahead and create our first dynamic ERL. I like to say dynamic because it's pushing it over to us dynamically over at 9line. We're getting that information from you right away. No waiting for any alley updates or anything. Put in our ELIN number that we want to map to this ERL, and then we're going to add the address for it. Save. Notice some of those fields were already filled in for us, so that's nice. And we'll insert that record there. Let's go ahead and add another one. And remember, the ELIN is the number that is sent to the 911 PSAP and is used for callbacks. Go ahead and save this one. Now I'm going to point something out here. I'm going to pause real quick. So the first one, I did not go through the step of doing the update button. I actually just saved the record there. I didn't insert and save. What I'm going to show you here is where I'm going to do it directly on the individual record. This is the way I would recommend doing it if you're doing a single record at a time. And then I'll also show you the way where you can do all the records all at once. So let me go ahead and show you what happens when we click Update. We're going to look for the success message to come through in a window on the right. There it is. Excellent. Now we can go ahead and save and close this. Been pushed over to 9line. I'm going to now show you what it's like to do a bulk TN update and update all your records. So now this is going to push all your records over, and it's perfectly fine. You can do this multiple times. If you're not sure, did I push one? Did I not push one? You can do it more than once. Go ahead and configure now a new one. So as we move on, this one is called the off-premises ERL. This is a special ERL, and essentially what's happening here is I'm calling it OFP ERL on purpose, so I know when I look at it that's what it's for. And you're going to see there's no ELIN field. So the only option I have is the route pattern for 10911. Because remember, as I said in the Communications Manager video, the off-premises users must be assigned a DID. That external phone number mask plus their directory number must create a 10-digit DID. No ifs, ands, or buts about it for now. That's how it works. And if you don't have it, OFP won't work. The reason for this is CER can't do any kind of mapping for it, so it has to push over the DID of the user's phone, so that in the event that there's a disconnect, the 911 dispatcher can call back to the individual who called 911 and get reconnected with them. And the only way that can happen is if that user has a DID, right? Okay, so this is a really, really important part here. No ELINs on your OFP ERL. That's on purpose. We can, of course, still provide notifications for Carey's Law. You might set up a different group in your organization for notifications when you've got somebody who's off-premise versus somebody who's on-premise. It just depends on your business policies. But now that I've got my OFP ERL configured, I'll go ahead and click Insert. There it is. And that's it for configuring the off-premises ERL. Let's go over to IP Subnets now. I'm going to define several IP Subnets that are going to relate to, first one's a site-to-site VPN. example. So I've got a /24 on this site-to-site VPN, and we're going to map it to the off-premises URL. When emergency responder sees a phone register in this 1099.30 subnet, it knows that it's off-premises based upon that subnet. I'm going to do another one. Go ahead and get this one plugged in. This is the IP address of my Expressway C. And again, emergency responder is going to know when it sees this, because I've mapped it right here, off-premises URL. Select it and add it in. It knows when it sees a registration come in on that IP address, it knows that that is an off-premises phone. Let me go ahead and define a couple more for the regular ERLs that we have. Now I'm doing this with subnet-based tracking. You could also define your ERLs on a switch port basis. You could also map your Wi-Fi access points to your ERLs. I'm just showing you, for example, how to do it via IP subnet, but there's other ways that you can do this. Go ahead and pick URL 1. We're going to say anything in 1099.20 is URL 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and add another one. Kind of went the long way in the menu here. We'll go ahead and add in another subnet for URL 2. And we're going to insert that as well. Okay, so now we've set up the IP subnet to ERL relationship so that emergency responder knows how to map that together. And as I pause here, I'm going to just take a look at this whole screen, right? So on my list of IP subnets, I have ERL 2, 1, and then my 2 off-premises ERLs. So emergency responder, the way I have it configured right now, because I'm not doing switch port tracking in this particular example, I'm just doing IP subnets. What I'm showing you is how I would track phones inside the four walls of my corporate office by using the subnets 1099.10, 1099.20. How I can track remote workers on a site-to-site VPN via that /24 1099.30. And then how I can also track my Expressway C MRA users by tracking the Expressway C's IP address, because that's what's going to show up on Communications Manager when somebody registers via MRA is the Expressway C IP. Same thing applies for an AnyConnect VPN pool or any other kind of network connectivity you have. We're simply telling emergency responder how to map that phone to an ERL. And in this particular case, we're doing it with IP subnet. All right, let's keep going here. We are almost done. Okay, let's go into our phone tracking. We're going to define our SNMP string so that CER can communicate with, if we had switches or Communications Manager, whatever the case may be, it needs to know how to communicate. So we're going to go ahead and now show this thing working in action. So you see the 1099.30, 111. The phone's not discovered yet. I'm going to go ahead and run the discovery here. And it's going to map that phone, because it's in the 1099.30 subnet, it's going to map that phone into the off-premises ERL. You can use the ERL debug tool to confirm this. Now I can see that. Yep, sure has. And it's got my CSF as well as my physical now showing off-premises. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and come over here and let's set up, or let's look at it rather from the IP subnet side, so I can see the same thing from here. There's my CSF, there's my 8865. So I can either do the debug or I can look at it from the subnet. I'm going to assign a location, so let me go ahead and drop a location in here. And let's put it at City Hall, 1200 Market Street in St. Louis, Missouri. This is actually our City Hall. And we'll then save this record, excuse me. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and show you what it's like to assign it. So I can pick City Hall, associate it, and once I get that successful message, that means it has pushed it to 9-line. That person's now ready to call 911, and it would show up as 1200 Market Street. Okay, let me go ahead and add another address just to show you what it's like to switch between locations. So this is the St. Louis Fire Department. Go ahead and we want to use real addresses here, by the way, because we're checking these addresses to make sure they're real. And I'm going to go ahead and assign and change this over to fire department, associate, wait for the success. There it is. Now 9line is going to represent that street address as being the fire department. And I can switch it back to City Hall. I can switch this back and forth all day long. And as soon as I see that success message, that means everything's working. So off-premise is working, phone's being tracked in the off-premise ERL, and we're now pretty much compliant, right? We've got our notifications, we've got our direct dial, we've got a valid callback number, so those are our 3 requirements for Carey's Law, and we've got a granular dispatchable location for our remote worker who happens to be working from City Hall, the fire department, but that's essentially showing you where the user goes in and sets that address and associates it to their phone. So that all happens in real time. Next thing I want to go over with you is essentially a little bit of troubleshooting. If you need to dig into any of the OFP, there's plenty of great documentation out there about general emergency responder stuff. I did not find a whole lot on OFP and especially E911Proxy because that gets a little tricky, especially with those MRA users. So I think it's really great to have a little tutorial on watching what happens when a phone registers and goes through the E911Proxy to OFP process. So this particular video, let me play this real quick for you. We're going to watch the logs on Communications Manager first, and I'm going to pause it when we get to the part I want to show you. Okay, so what's happened right here? It says requesting locations from 10/9/11/11. All right, so Communications Manager has actually gone over to emergency responder and said, hey, tell me about the locations that are assigned to the user mark. Remember when we did the user association and Communications Manager in the first video? This is where this is all coming into play as well. It's part of the story. So Communications Manager needs to know what devices I own so that it can go ask emergency responder about my locations. And specific for this device is attempting to register. Another thing that I'll point out is that we do have the ability to actually block calls from a phone if we wanted to. That's what you're seeing in that couple lines up where it says allow outbound calls. So you can do that. I don't recommend doing that, but just so you know, there are some service parameters that you can turn on inside Call Manager to actually block calls until somebody goes through the process of picking a location on their phone. So that's what that means. All right, let's keep going here. So we're getting those locations back. We're putting the message up on the screen. And then I'm going to pause again. What happened is essentially we see about 7 seconds later, looks at the 124018 stamp, the user actually pressed a location or picked a location using the soft keys on the 8865 in this case, and said, I want to tell the phone system and tell emergency responder I'm at this location. And so again, because Call Manager is the one proxying it with that E911Proxy, it receives that soft key press, knows which option was picked, and then post that selection, that choice, back to emergency responder to key off or to essentially do what you saw me do with the off-premises user portal page, right? So we're making those decisions about switching between City Hall or fire department or whatever right here on the phone screen and my phone's registered. In this particular case, it was over a site-to-site VPN, but you could also do it over MRA or AnyConnect, any of those. So it all is happening just like that. So as soon as you see this set, it's ready to go, it's successful, and the phone can now make a 911 call. And so that's it. You see the address got set. So in this particular case, I picked the fire department location. We see that in the location name over on the left-hand side. We see the house number, we see the street name, we see the city, and so on. So we know that that was successful. And if we were blocking calls, you'll see 3 lines up from the bottom there where it says new allow outbound calls value equals true. That means the user has successfully set their location. And if we did have those service parameters configured for the emergency alternate CSS, we would now allow outbound calls to take place, and so we would inherit the regular CSS on the device. So a lot of really cool stuff happening underneath the covers here. You do need to turn on your E911Proxy debugs, and I'll show you the log file here if you want to take a look at this just for fun, or if you're troubleshooting a problem, you can use the tail command to get in here and take a look at it, and it'd be under Tomcat, and then the E911Proxy service, and whatever the most recent log file is, and you can just tail that to watch it as it's happening. All right, so that was great. Let's see what's happening. A little less noise over on the emergency responder side, but essentially what you're seeing is emergency responder telling you, hey, I got this incoming web request from the communications manager. There's the IP address of my communications manager, 10.9.11.10, and it's asking to check the subnets, right? Because we're saying, is this an off-premise subnet? And then give me the locations, right? And then once I have those locations, I need to push back the message saying this location was selected for the user. And you can kind of see some of that in the URL here. You see the CR provider device, what looks like to be a GUID, and then the extension, the external phone number mask representing the full DID that was picked in the location that went along with it. If you want to watch that one, you don't need to turn a debug on to watch this one. You'll see there's a file tail active log for the local host file. Notice that these are being posted here with 200 messages. If you have a problem with your CER Axle user that we created, you will see like a 401 or a 403 or something along those lines instead of the 200 messages, representing that you have a permissions problem with that user. So you want to go back and double check that CER Axle user and make sure it's working the way I showed you. At this point, you've now done everything in order to be compliant. Let me show you a couple live demos of what what the OFP part looks like on a 8865. So let's go ahead and flip over to that. One sec. Okay, so now we're going to get into the demo part. So the first thing you're going to see is the registration message on the 8865 like you normally would when the phone's booting up and trying to connect. So once we get through the initial registration message, you're going to see for just a second perhaps the line appearance and whatnot. But then immediately thereafter, we're going to go into this screen here, which is the disclaimer. Remember, this was configured using the E911 system messages inside Communications Manager, so you can completely customize these to whatever your organization requires. After this part is done, we're going to select our location. So we're hit next, and then we're going to go ahead and select our location. And once we pick our location, we're going to wait for it to populate that information inside CER, as we saw in those debugs we were looking at earlier. Once that's done, we're going to get our successful message, and we're off to the races. This phone is now ready to make a compliant 911 call. Okay, so now let's take a look at an example of Jabber and what the user experience will be like. So we're going to go ahead and launch Jabber here. When it launches, immediately we get that E911 notification URL. I'm going to go ahead and click on a link I've embedded in that page. It takes me into CER, into OFP portal. You can see right now that my phone is in a not discovered status. It's because I haven't hit OK yet. So now that I've hit OK, the registration process can actually continue. We're going to give it a minute here for CER to pick up the registration. Now it has, and I can switch the location on my phone right now. Let's go ahead and put it over to Fire Department and associate it. And now my Jabber client is ready to go. If it makes a call, it's going to advertise the appropriate location that I've associated to that phone. And I can switch this back and forth all I want all day. That's how it works for Jabber users. All right, so I'm glad that you stuck with me for this long. This has been a really intense and very quick video going through a lot of information, so I appreciate you making it till the end. Here's what I would say. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We do this a lot, and we're here to help you get your system configured and help you get compliant. You can visit our website. You can reach out to me directly with the contact info below, but most of all, thank you for watching, and we really do hope to see your organization be fully compliant and help protect those employees. Have a great day and be safe.